Locke suggested that everyone had the right to defend their life, health, liberty, and property, and his writings are an explanation of the reason behind the Glorious Revolution, supporting the rule of central government in defining people's rights in relation to civil liberties in opposition to the rule of absolute monarchy, which almost certainly further influenced the American patriots' views on the unfair and unjust tyranny of George III of England and his government, as because the civil liberties of the people were violated, this justified the uprising of the colonies against the British. Locke was also a firm believer that government should be formed to protect the rights of people, which was a sentiment that Jefferson shared, and Locke also stated, in the interest of citizens, that they have the natural right to replace government, which is an idea that is also stated in the Declaration of Independence, as it states that Americans should have the right to alter or abolish a government that infringes on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In September of 1776, Jefferson returned to Virginia, leaving Congress to take up his position in the Virginia House of Delegates, where he began the task of reforming the Virginia Legal Code, whilst a year later, in 1777, Jefferson also proposed the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which is a document based on the English tradition of separation of church and state, effectively removing the Episcopalian Church as the official religion of the Virginian state. But, despite his efforts, the bill was not accepted until much later, when he was acting as minister to France in January of 1786. This separation of church and state also formed the foundation of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution in December of 1791 that guarantees individual rights such as freedom of expression, the right to petition, the right to public assembly, as well as the right to religious freedom of choice, which essentially prohibited Congress or federal government from promoting one religion over another. On the 1st of June 1779, 36-year-old Jefferson was selected by the General Assembly to be the governor of Virginia, succeeding the long-serving governor Patrick Henry, who gained victory over 2 ballots, competing with both John Page and Thomas Nelson, and after this, he was also re-elected in 1780, completing his term on the 4th of June, 1781. During this phase of the war, Jefferson and his family moved to Shockoe Hill in the spring of 1780, whilst the Assembly also moved the Governor's Palace from Williamsburg to Richmond as a tactical move to avoid incoming attacks by enemies such as the Southern Indians and the British Army under General Benedict Arnold via Chesapeake Bay, who, aided by the Royal Navy, had already gained control over Georgia and South Carolina and was moving into North Virginia, culminating in 1781 in British troops occupying and burning Richmond to the ground before retreating. During this crisis, Jefferson escaped Richmond just ahead of the British forces, while shortly after, he narrowly avoided capture by a cavalry force sent to apprehend him by the British General Charles Cornwallis, but his flight in the face of the enemy meant that when the General Assembly reconvened in June 1781, it conducted an inquiry into Jefferson's actions, which eventually concluded that he'd acted with honor, although despite this, he was not elected as governor. Although the colonial situation had seemed to be dire in early 1781, the tables were finally turned on the British later that year, when the French Navy defeated the Royal Navy and the Battle of Chesapeake, cutting off Cornwallis's supply lines from the main British base in New York, meaning that he was soon forced to surrender at the Battle of Yorktown in October of 1781, effectively signaling the end of British resistance in the southern states, until eventually, when the British realized that maintaining a war footing across the Atlantic was impossible, the Revolutionary War finally came to an end with the Treaty of Paris on the 3rd of September, 1783, which effectively sealed, signed, and delivered American independence. Although many in the New World, including Jefferson, no doubt celebrated the colonial victory over what was then the most powerful empire in the world, jubilation did not last for long, as less than a year later, his wife Martha passed away of apoplexy on the 6th of September, 1782, shortly after the birth of their 6th child, and devastated, Jefferson sought solace in friends, most notably the Marquis de Chastellux, and various accounts state that during her decline and death, Thomas was inconsolable, and after she passed away, aged just 33, he had the epitaph torn from him by death inscribed on her tombstone. Despite this loss, from 1783 to 1784, Jefferson became delegate to the newly formed Congress of the Confederation for Virginia, marking the beginning of the Confederate years of American political history, and it was at this time that he compiled a plan of governance for the newly created westernmost states that came about as a consequence of the Land Ordinance of 1784, in which Virginia handed over to the national government the vast area that it claimed northwest of the Ohio River. Jefferson argued that this territory should not be consumed by the older 13 states, but instead should become 9 new separate states in their own right, and furthermore, that slavery should be banned within their borders. However, once again, objections were raised in Congress, and the ban on slavery, known as the Jefferson Proviso, was withdrawn from the proposals, although 3 years later, in the so-called Northwest Ordinance of 1787, slavery was finally banned, which was eventually, over the coming decades, rolled out across the majority of the northern states of the Union, forming the dividing line that would in large part bring the slave-owning southern states into conflict with the North over the coming century. The primary reasons for the southern states rejecting the abolition of slavery was down to the fact, as previously mentioned, that their economies, by and large, relied on slave labor for their income far more than the northernmost states, whose wealth increasingly came from foreign trade and industry. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the modern populous and wealthy northern states would far outshine the relatively old-fashioned economies of the South, in turn meaning that when the American Civil War erupted in 1861, the South's relatively small economy and population was eventually overwhelmed by the industry and manpower of the North. Throughout 1784, Thomas Jefferson lobbied Congress for changes to the monetary coinage, replacing sterling as currency in favor of the Spanish dollar decimal system, but this was, like many of his proposals up until now, rejected. Nonetheless, Jefferson was soon chosen to join Benjamin Franklin and John Adams in Paris as Minister Plenipotentiary, meaning an official fully authorized to represent a government. He was appointed to succeed Benjamin Franklin as Minister to France. When he was quizzed about the appointment by the French Foreign Minister, the Count de Vergennes, who commented, "You replaced Monsieur Franklin, I hear," Jefferson replied, quote, "I succeed. No man can replace him." The reason for the American delegation being in France was not simply due to the kingdom's assistance against the British in the Revolutionary War, but was also due to the United States seeking to forge economic ties with a plethora of European nations, including the Dutch, who Thomas, along with John Adams, secured loans from in order to consolidate America's debts, that were in large part due to having to pay for French military assistance against the British. Whilst it is also said that during this time in France, Jefferson fell in love with an Italian-English woman named Maria Cosway. However, his relationship with her did not last, as she returned home to Britain, as did Jefferson to America in 1789, just as France was engulfed by the chaos of its revolution. In the months before Jefferson's return, the United States Constitution was ratified in 1788, guaranteeing civil freedoms for Americans and also establishing civil government, the wording of which was partly influenced by Jefferson's recent publications, and after returning home, Thomas was rewarded for his efforts, as he was installed as the first United States Secretary of State by the new President George Washington, who had come out of retirement to lead his nation, largely due to the fact that he was politically neutral and had the admiration and support of virtually all Americans. It was in or around this phase in Jefferson's life that he began a relationship with a live-in slave named Sally Hemings, who he may have had 6 children with, although she would later die years after Jefferson and would remain a slave throughout his relationship with her. Furthermore, it is this supposed relationship with one of his slaves, as well as Jefferson's keeping of slaves, that have caused some to criticize him, as, on the other hand, he claimed to be against slavery, yet he owned slaves himself. Although some suggest he kept slaves, as he knew they would be treated well under his ownership, whilst others say that he kept slaves due to him being in debt. But then again, as the owning of slaves was banned in many states at this time, it could also be argued that Jefferson owning them at all was hypocritical and unnecessary. It was also during this period that the American Bill of Rights of 1791 was ratified, which included Jefferson's Virginia Statute of Religious Freedoms, and also consisted of amendments to the American Constitution, restricting central or federal government influence of civil freedom and autonomy of the Union states. And it was during this period that Jefferson also worked alongside the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of War, Henry Knox, and Attorney General Edmund Randolph, whose powers were limited under the Bill of Rights, which stated that all powers not referred to in the U.S. Constitution would remain in the hands of individual states and not the federal government. During Jefferson's time as Secretary of State, the first issue of the National Gazette was published in October 1791 by Philip Freneau, who was a supporter of Jefferson's politics and represented those who advocated the views behind his political philosophy. However, certain quarters of the American cabinet were not so keen on Thomas's ideas, as in 1792, Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton came to a disagreement concerning Treasury affairs, which was mitigated by Washington, who wrote to both parties pleading for the reconciliation of both men, who had disagreed over Hamilton's handling of the Treasury, marking the start of a political rivalry between the two. A large part of the reason the politically impartial Washington had been elevated to the position of president was that the founding fathers had formed two political factions in the aftermath of the American Revolution, those being the Federalists, such as Hamilton, who advocated the centralization of power, and the Democratic Republicans, like Jefferson, who argued for greater control in the form of laws or constitutional amendments on the power of central government, arguing for civil liberties and a degree of state independence. These differing philosophies soon came to a head when the Republican Jefferson disagreed with the Federalist Hamilton about the creation of a national bank, as Hamilton wanted to establish a national bank which would take control of state debt and loans, whilst Jefferson was strongly opposed to the measure and wanted the states, of which the new nation was comprised, to retain fiscal independence from central or federal government. Nonetheless, Jefferson eventually agreed to the bank's creation on condition that the nation's capital was moved to Georgetown in 1790, which was in turn renamed in George Washington's honor in 1791 and is today known as Washington, D.C. Despite this compromise, there was still concern